Welcome back to the London Futurist podcast. How do we keep our technology from slipping beyond our control? That's the subtitle of the latest book by our guest in this episode, Wendell Wallach. Wendell is the Carnegie-Uehiro Fellow at Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs, where he co-directs the Artificial Intelligence and Equality Initiative. He is also Emeritus Chair of Technology and Ethics Studies at Yale University's Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics, a scholar with the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics, a fellow at the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technology, and a senior advisor to the Hastings Center. Earlier in his life, Wendell was founder and president of two computer consulting companies, Farpoint Solutions and Omnia Consulting, Inc. Wendell, welcome to the London Futurist podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
Great to have you with us, Wendell.
Thank you, Colin.
Wendell, tell us a bit more about your backstory. How did you come to be so involved with technology in general and AI in particular?
Well, I've lived a very idiosyncratic life, and perhaps at some other occasion we can get more into my story. It's kind of a tale of how people can follow their own instincts and perhaps create an unusual life. My father was a doctor, a historian, a scientist, so I was fed technology along with mother's milk when I came out of the womb. But I was very much a 60s activist, involved in nearly every facet of 60s activism. I've meditated for 50 years, and that's gotten me very involved in thinking about how thought, how consciousness function, and that also dragged me into the evolving and new cognitive sciences. That was really the emergence in the 1970s of a new field of research that actually combined psychology and computer science and neuroscience, anthropology, and many other fields. So I had this general fascination with all of this. There was a point when I stepped back and created my own companies to make a living, and they were both computer consulting companies, as you mentioned. But I got involved with computers because I was trying to get some books out of my head. I hated whiteout and I hated copying paper, so I was hopeful the computers would make it easier for me to write. But by 2001, I realized I wasn't getting any books out of my head. I was just caught up in these businesses, and I stepped back from them. At that time, I realized that a great deal of what I wanted to write about, I didn't know the latest science on. I didn't know some of the emerging fields. And that brought me into this Yale Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics working group on technology and ethics that, interestingly enough, was co-founded by Nick Bostrom, who you all know well. Within a couple of years, Nick had gone to Oxford, and the other co-founder had an accident. So I was asked to take over the technology and ethics working group at Yale. And that put me into the whole world of emerging technologies, transhumanism, nanotechnologies, other areas of concern that were just coming to the fore.
And would you recommend meditating to the rest of us to help us make sense of our lives and be better people?
It's not meditation per se, but I think perhaps life is really about self-understanding, is really about understanding how you function and why you do what you do, and when that is adaptive and when that's maladaptive. I think of meditation or self-reflection as a core tool, a core aptitude that should be cultivated in everyone.
So I'm guessing your books are trying to help society as a whole to understand what's going on as well in the same reflective spirit. So let's turn to the new book. I've already mentioned the subtitle, How to Keep Technology from Slipping Beyond Our Control, but the title you chose seems a bit more enigmatic, A Dangerous Master. What do you mean by that?
Well, to be honest, I did not exactly pick that title. The publishers, Oxford University Press. Their marketing department and one of their directors did not like the title I picked, which was Techstorm. And they asked me for possible substitutes, and I gave them this quote from a Nobel Prize winning, 1921 Nobel Prize winning historian and internationalist Christian Los Lunga, who was a Norwegian. And in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, he said, "Technology is a good servant, but a dangerous master." That was what Oxford liked. I was a little bit iffy about it because a dangerous master is very much an introduction to the breadth of new fields of science and technology. There's a little bit of history. There's, of course, some ethics, lots of vignettes. I was not particularly focusing on existential risks or artificial general intelligence or superintelligence, so I certainly discussed those topics there. And I knew that picking that title, many readers would think immediately that it was about artificial superintelligence. But it's really about technology much more broadly and how it can be a dangerous master, even though it is clearly a necessary and good servant.
Well, your book, as you mentioned, is full of fascinating vignettes, things that people may have heard of a little bit through news reports, but it's my perception that you provide a much rounder picture of the factors involved. I wonder if you could pick one or two of these incidents that you explore in the book and talk us through them.
Well, let me use one example that really goes into many other examples. This was the work of Thomas Midgley Jr. Thomas Midgley Jr. was an inventor in the 1920s and 30s and 40s who invented what initially seemed to be two of the greatest forms of technology. First was leaded gasoline, which solved the knocking problem, which was endemic to all engines at that time.
Knocking problem?
The knocking problem.
For those of us too young to know about that, what is it?
Car engines knocked. They didn't have the smoothness that we see today. So you would have a lot of pops and knocks and other things. Putting lead in gasoline solved that problem. So those of you who know about lead in gasoline get a sense of where I'm already going with this. But the other thing he invented was CFCs, fluorocarbons, which again gave us this wonderful new form of refrigeration and also became a propellant in aerosol cans, which had been invented by Eric Roheim right around the same period, 1926. Well, aerosol cans had very little usage, but during World War II, the military realized that it could use aerosol cans to spread DDT, the insecticide, which again had been discovered only in 1939, and they used to control malaria and typhus. After the war, DDT was used to raise crop yields in agriculture. Well, we all know the story of that. That goes on until the 1960s when Rachel Carson publishes a book called Silent Spring, in which she is critical of DDT and why she believes it is responsible for the deaths of all kinds of birds. So Silent Spring is referring to the death of birds. DDT gets banned in the US in 1962. And by 2004, we have a worldwide ban under the Stockholm Convention. That, on the surface, has looked very good. Rachel Carson and her book were seen as the founders of the modern environmental movement. But the reality is that the ban on DDT has had two sides to it. The World Health Organization proclaimed that in 2012 there had been 207 million cases of malaria in the world, and the deaths were over 627,000. So again, two sides, a benefit and a detriment.
Wendell, can I just interrupt to ask, is it true that DDT effectively eliminated malaria in the US? Because malaria was common, particularly in the southern states, and it was effectively wiped out by DDT. Is that right?
It was in the first round. Now, malaria is reappearing mildly, but that's usually imported in one form or another. So DDT in agriculture was a good thing. It was a good thing in Africa. But it's a double-edged sword. And that's what we get into so many of these technologies. They're double-edged swords. But the other side of this story, of course, is Thomas Midgley's creation of fluorocarbons. And as we know, they are super greenhouse gases. And together with gasoline, are major contributors to global climate change. Do we have solutions for that? Well, perhaps conservation measures could be solutions. But if those aren't effective, some people are putting forward various forms of geoengineering, which is a term for the use of technology to control climate change. And some of these forms of geoengineering have potentially worse consequences than the problem they're meant to solve, or at least look on the surface and are criticized as having potentially worse consequences. So again, that was just one story of the entanglement of so many different technologies and both their beneficial and detrimental sides.
Well, it's certainly the case that some of these technologies had drawbacks that weren't understood for a long time after they were introduced. Hence, the ozone layer problem was growing for a long time before people, almost by accident, discovered that it was a problem.
Right.
Are there lessons to be learned from how these problems were dealt with as well, such as the mechanisms to have lead removed from petrol, or the mechanisms, the Montreal Protocol, in which governments of the world decided that the big chemical companies who at one stage were saying there's no alternative, we have to use CFCs in our aerosols, we have to use CFCs in our fridges, and because the governments of the world spoke with a sufficiently joined up voice, the big chemical companies found alternatives, which in many ways were better. So are there encouraging lessons to be drawn from these past examples as well?
Well, encouraging and discouraging at the same time. Encouraging that the protocols were put in place and that CFCs were over time banned. Discouraging that it was so slow and there was so much resistance to it. I think the great tragedy for humanity is we're very short-sighted. We're very poor at taking a look at the long-term consequences of our actions. And we're even poorer yet at looking at the trade-offs of different courses of action, which is one of my big concerns. Could they have understood that CFCs were problematic at the time? Probably not. Could they have understood that lead in gasolines was problematic? Midgley himself had lead poisoning 2 years after he proposed this solution. So that's a little bit more complicated whether that could have been dealt with. But I think the main lesson to learn is let's be a little less cavalier about acting on the science, recognizing that science isn't always correct and every action can have unintended consequences. But if we dawdle too much, we get to the situation that we have today, where we're in the midst of unprecedented heat. Already in June and early July in the United States, and actually it's unprecedented heat across the globe from what I can see.
There are some people who say, well, we will be able to figure these things out. We shouldn't panic unnecessarily in advance. So long as we're able to notice when things are going wrong and adapt, we'll be fine. If, on the other hand, we legislate too much, we will damage innovation. We will not have the benefits of the likes of DDT, which you discussed earlier.
That's the double-edged sword that we're always dealing with technology. There are many examples of positive things that were unintended that happened in the use of these technologies. So now we get into the question of what risks are appropriate, at what stages we should put in place effective regulations, and which technologies we should be embracing.
Let me jump in with a bit of a contribution about unleaded petrol, because many, many years ago, for my sins, I was retail product manager for motor fuels for an oil company. And we were introducing unleaded petrol in the UK at the time. Interestingly, when unleaded petrol was introduced in most countries, it wasn't to remove lead as an emission. It was to enable catalytic converters to be used. Catalytic converters eliminate nitrous oxides and other pollutants from the atmosphere. And lead wasn't considered to be a big problem. In the UK, catalytic converters were introduced a lot later, and unleaded was introduced for its own sake, on the argument that lead emissions in petrol were causing damage to intelligence levels of young children living by busy roads. There's a lot of controversy about that argument. Some people still say it's true, but I'm not sure there's an awful lot of evidence for it.
There actually was a lot of evidence, but it was actually the evidence around lead paint and the fact that lead paint would get dusty and come off and kids would be able to, in effect, consume it.
Yes, there's no question that lead is a poison, and if you ingest enough of it, it will kill you. In fact, the idea of mad hatters, as in Alice in Wonderland, came from the fact they used to line the insides of hats with lead. And they would get lead on their fingers and they would ingest it and literally go mad. And so having lead-lined pipes is a very bad idea. But lead emissions from petrol, I don't think there's an enormous amount of evidence to show that that's actually very dangerous. Although I'm sure lots of people will come up with evidence that it is.
I didn't know that etymology of Mad Hatters. That's great.
What this shows, I think, is that there's a lot of controversy about the science in many of these examples. The chemical company was able to marshal some evidence that there was no threat from CFCs to ozone. And we have plenty of examples of debates over climate change, how serious it is.
Exactly.
How can the ordinary person disentangle all the scientific debates from the other arguments about social well-being, environmental well-being? It just seems incredibly hard.
It is. And it's incredibly hard for you and me, and we try to develop a degree of expertise around this. And the expertise becomes more and more thin when you become somebody like myself who's really a dilettante in all these fields. I mean, I know an awful lot about a lot of fields, but I also know where the limits of my understanding are. And therefore, there become these questions of when the opinions I'm putting forward are really just opinions and are not really worthy of being acted upon. But some people look at me as an authority, and therefore they think that if I say something, well, maybe I know because I give expression to various ethical and humanistic concerns, which make them think I'm trustworthy. But I'm not trustworthy on all these things, and I don't think we, humanity as a whole, is trustworthy on some of these things. But that doesn't justify going ahead with technologies in an imbalanced way that serve heavy business purposes, but it's much more ambiguous whether they're serving the interests of the public or not. And I think that even though the science is not always authoritative or conclusive, I do think that in this day and age, we usually get a pretty good 360 view of what's going on, but we need to bring more experts together to talk together. It's not just a question of the science, it's a question of what the trade-offs are in the quality of life for people. It's a question of whether the economic benefits are really being distributed in any meaningful way, or that this is all to the benefits of those who own capital and are not to the benefits of humanity more widely.
Well, Wendell, I certainly see you as an eminent, very trustworthy person in the field. So let me ask you what seems to me to be one of the most important questions flying around at the moment. It's highly contested. On the one hand of a debate, you have Sam Altman, Leopold Aschenbrenner saying superintelligence is 2 to 5 years away. On the other hand, you have Yann LeCun, Gary Marcus, a whole host of others saying, no, it's not. It's decades, quite possibly centuries away. And oddly for him, we find Ray Kurzweil's kind of in the middle, still saying what he's been saying since the 1990s. 2029, superintelligence, 2045, we merge with them and we have the singularity. Where are you on that spectrum of debate?
I think we don't know enough about intelligence to really know. I don't think we're seeing things in artificial intelligence yet, as remarkable as it is, particularly with these large generative models, that can make us conclude that AI systems are going to have all forms of intelligence. And the two I point to are emotional intelligence and moral intelligence. I don't think there's any evidence that these systems are going to have either of these. And I don't think they're going to have the intellectual acumen to deduce what would be the right actions, either ethically or emotionally. And I think those two are very entangled with each other.
There's probably two ways of looking at that, though, aren't there? One is whether they can replicate human moral judgment and human emotional behavior. And they certainly can do that. What they can't do, at least we suppose at the moment, is to understand it in a conscious way. They're not conscious, as far as we know. And so their moral judgments are kind of lacking in an important dimension. But they can make moral judgments. They can make moral judgments based on the corpus of what humans' judgments have been.
But the moral judgments we've got to make today aren't so much about the corpus of what human judgments have been to date. They're about totally new, devilish moral decision-making processes in which we don't have all the information we need. A confluence of values can impinge upon the judgment we need to make, and people are going to prioritize those values very differently. And we cannot determine the consequences of all the various courses of action that we might be able to take. And yet we still have to pick an action, not necessarily the perfect action, but an action which maximizes the benefits and minimizes the risks. However, that's the work we actually don't do. We do kind of simplistic, kind of consequentialist framing of ethical decision making, but we don't look at the fact that we may actually have many courses of action, each with its own trade-offs, and we need to look at the trade-offs of each course of action, make a decision which we think is the best action to take. But it's not just taking the best course of action, it's also ameliorating to the best of our ability the negative trade-offs. We have been immature in really taking on those kinds of decision-making processes. And my God, it's almost impossible for an individual to do, but we need to be able to engage in much more collective decision-making processes that include not just the scientific evidence, but also the political ramifications, the economic ramifications, the societal ramifications of various courses.
So what are the best examples of that collaborative decision-making that brings in multiple types of expertise? If we look at IPCC, the international collection of scientists who join together all their ideas on climate science, that doesn't seem to be particularly successful. Are there better examples? Can we do things better?
It's not unsuccessful, but it has no political clout. And it's not clear whether IPCC has a broad enough participation of stakeholders. And it doesn't engage in what I would say is these long extended processes of going through the various courses of action. So for example, on geoengineering, we should look at all the different forms of geoengineering and start making a decision about which should be delayed or which have to be tested before they could be put into place. Geoengineering experiments, for example, that would feed the atmosphere with sulfates and therefore reflect sunlight. They don't solve climate change, but they could slow down its rate each year or its rate of growth each year. But we need to be looking much more comprehensively. We need to be much more open to people who are putting forward idiosyncratic solutions and doing some of the science to understand those idiosyncratic solutions.
So where are these conversations most likely to take place? When I look around the world, and it's not just as an explosion in the capabilities of AI, there's an explosion, it seems, in the number of different organizations that have been set up, each saying, hey, we're going to have a better conversation, a better collaboration on the future of technology. Where do you see the best hope in amongst all these organizations? Should we let 1,000 flowers bloom and see what's successful? Or are there some that you can already say, let's get together and support this, please?
Well, I think a lot of these organizations are relatively harmless. They have good intent. So if they want to bloom as flowers and see if the flowers that they seed are some contribution, more power to them. I don't want to restrict organizations, but I don't think we've demonstrated the will yet to collectively work together in the ways that we are going to need to fully understand the environment we're moving into, that we've already moved into. I know the limits of what I can understand, and I do understand the need for many more of these round tables where different stakeholders sit together and in a concerted, hopefully trustworthy way, work through the ramifications. And perhaps AI can have a seat at the table, or perhaps some enhanced human will have a seat at the table. I'm not worried about that. I'm more worried about the fact that we are willing to defer to processes that are already biased, or we are willing to defer to stakeholders who don't necessarily have all of our interests in place, regardless of what they say. I don't care what Sam Altman says anymore. I don't mean to be cruel to Sam. He's a nice guy. But Sam Altman created OpenAI together with some other people as a nonprofit that was going to solve the AI safety problem or do significant work on that in advance of artificial superintelligence. And instead, in order to work on that problem, they decided they had to create large-scale models that they could work on. They create large-scale models, and lo and behold, they realize that they are commercially valuable, and therefore they are no longer a nonprofit. And I will put Microsoft in the same bag. Among the oligopoly, Microsoft were the good guys. But Microsoft also knew that when they took on OpenAI's tools, that they did not have any, let alone sufficient safeguards in place, nor had they done effective testing. So it's pretty clear that you can't trust them necessarily. They may have good intentions, and they may give expression to them, but with their fiduciary responsibilities to their stockholders, you can't trust them. You can't fully trust people like me who are vaguely seen as the good faith brokers, because we appreciate the complexity of the problems and the need for more concerted collective work to select the pathways, the courses of action that are going to have the greatest benefit. And then you get into the question, benefits for whom? Should it be benefits for the futurists who have personal desires for radical life extension or to be uploaded into an artificial superintelligence or so forth? Well, that's still only a tiny minority of the population. And at this point, we have no way of knowing whether those technologies might have downsides for the public more broadly. In fact, we do know that they will have downsides for the public more broadly, but because of our own desires, because of our own interests, we are quick to dismiss who's important or what's important in this and what isn't. In that way, we have no comprehensive understanding of what we're dealing with. We have a bunch of individuals with idiosyncratic understanding, largely driven by their own desires and interests.
Well, for what it's worth, I have to say I share your assessment of Microsoft. I used to admire many of the things that Microsoft executives said. I particularly liked Brad Smith, who seemed to be very sensible in the remarks he made about governing technology. But they have been in this race to succeed in the search space. They wanted to overtake Google so that people would go to Bing to search rather than Google. And their chance to win that race by capitalizing on OpenAI has led them, it seems, to take shortcuts. So what is the solution here? Should we just look around for another good guy, hope that Anthropic is going to do it right? Or is it that there are problems with, let's use that word, capitalist system, which lead good guys always to, in the end, be subverted by profit motives? in which case we need to up the democratic oversight of these capitalist organizations.
I think it's not only up the democratic oversight, but you let them sit at the table.
I'd like to jump in here if I could. I think it's all very well to worry about the misaligned incentives that are inherent in capitalism, and there are clearly misaligned incentives, but the alternatives really aren't any better. Can you actually imagine Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-il willingly stopping developing a very powerful and very dangerous AI system? They would rush at it. So capitalism, if it's twinned with a liberal democracy, is probably the least bad system we have for having the possibility of exerting some sort of control over these systems. And of course, the trouble with it is that if we do exert control, California has regulations coming along that say that really advanced systems can't be developed. The EU AI Act has similar possible breaks. If we do stop the development of really advanced AI systems in America and to a lesser extent Europe and possibly China, then they will simply press ahead in Russia and North Korea.
So I have not said anything about stopping development, because I don't believe you can stop development. But I think you can put development under a regulatory umbrella where they have to prove that appropriate safeguards are in place before they allow the deployment of technologies that they know will have serious downsides. And I think that's the problem. And I don't think you can stop having the AI oligopoly at the table because they understand the technologies better than anyone else. But I wish they would be in a more concerted effort with the AI safety and security community to work thoroughly on trying to research those courses of action. Right now, a smidgen of what is being spent on expanding these large language models is being spent on AI safety and security. That's unacceptable. And I'm not worried about what Russia and China are going to do, not because they won't speed ahead and maybe be unsafe in what they do, but I happen to believe they'll pay for it if they don't put appropriate measures in place. And to make matters potentially better, I actually think China sort of understands that. They don't fully understand whether or how they can cooperate with the West. But I've been in China a lot, and I think the AI safety and security community is fairly large. They are not necessarily hell-bent on militarizing AI, but if they are going to be in this kind of tension with the U.S., yes, every time we ratchet up tensions, they'll ratchet up another notch. And before long, we're all going to wherever we're going.
But there is an argument that although China may publicly speak admirably, behind the scenes they are applying AI to their weapon systems. And why not? There are videos of robotic dogs with machine guns strapped to them. Again, it sort of makes sense why they would want to do that. It frees up humans from being involved in life-threatening situations. There is this scenario which Leopold Aschenbrenner, the young researcher who used to work in the superalignment team at OpenAI, after graduating top of his class at Columbia, aged just 19, he's written this thesis arguing that the whole conversation about AI is going to be overtaken by military powers, or even better expressed, the national security organizations effectively taking control of the AI labs. They will say, this is too important a thing to be left to the whims or the mechanisms of big business. This is so critical for the future of their own national security that they have to jump in and take charge, whisking off the leading researchers perhaps to a 2020s version of Los Alamos, where the Manhattan Project took place.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a credible scenario? Or is this just somebody who's a bit too young and naive being led astray by his own imagination?
No, I think it's a credible scenario, but I think it's one of many scenarios right now. And I'm afraid we get in this conversation too caught up in yesterday's arguments about other technologies, and we are not looking, again, in a comprehensive way at what AI is. AI is going to touch on every aspect of society, already is. going to be embedded in control systems everywhere. It's not going to be just these large language models, and it's not just going to be artificial general intelligence or even superintelligence, presuming those are fully possible, which I still remain a friendly skeptic, friendly to the can-do engineering spirit, skeptical that we really understand what intelligence or consciousness or a lot of other things are and whether they can be adequately reproduced computationally. But that's neither here nor there. My sense is we are dealing with a technology that is going to need vast safety and security infrastructure. Whether that gets controlled by the military or whether that gets dealt with within each vertical sector in which it's being deployed. So the WHO has a robust system for looking at the deployment of medical technologies, or the same for other industries, or whether that gets handled so poorly that we start to see crisis after crisis after crisis, and some more demagogic leader feels, well, then the only thing that can be done is that we turn this totally over to the military. And we do it in a way where we continue to be in direct military competition with other countries, whether that's someone as robust as China or someone who's potentially as weak as Russia. It makes no difference. They would still have the technology. So I think we are in a different universe. We need different forms of governance. We need different forms of decision-making processes. We need a new ethos to drive the next generation. And so far, there's not the evidence that we are taking any of this seriously enough. And the trajectory we're on is not good. In AI, the trajectory is largely about surveillance and replacing human work. But AI could be about so many other things. It could be about complementing human work, about ensuring that humans are there to supply security mechanisms where the AI may not be able to enact an effective mechanism.
Wendell, you say you're not calling for development of advanced AI systems to be halted. And you're certainly right that there's not nearly enough money being spent by big tech or anybody else on trying to figure out how to make them safe. But the truth is we don't know how to make them safe. And there's no sign that in the foreseeable future we're going to know how to make them safe. We do not understand really how they work. And therefore, the only way to avoid them being dangerous, which is what we also want, is to stop developing them. There's no alternative other than to stop. And my worry is that if we stop in Europe and America, and as you say, I think China would as well, because they don't like unconstrained minds there, then you just leave the field open for the bad actors. And it's not just Russia and Korea. It's also the odd rogue billionaire, and there's quite a few of them, and there's mafia organizations. So relinquishment is the only way to actually make them safe, and even that doesn't work, it would seem.
I don't know what we know and don't know. I've seen a lot of theses that says we ultimately cannot control AI. I've seen a lot of people say, no, we potentially can control it, but it's not that we're seeing the robust research to show it can be controlled. It's also a question of at what level does it need control? It needs different kinds of controls, again, if it's an AI module that's embedded in a control system for electricity or something else that we care about. But it's obviously a very different thing if we're talking about creating artificial general intelligence that we can't control. The problem is we don't know we can create artificial general intelligence. We've got some pretty good arguments out there that we can't. We've got some pretty good arguments out there that we can. So I think we can still continue to move forward if we had the robust mechanisms. We're both creating the systems and we're looking at what we anticipate that we can't control. Now, to be sure, we already have systems doing things that we don't anticipate. These are probabilistic machines. At times, they're going to do the low probability, high impact event. So in that sense, they are already dangerous. But we do a lot of things in this world that are based on probabilities. And only when we think the high impact decision is likely to really happen, then do we put mechanisms and say we're going to relinquish this technology.
There's at least two types of uncertainty when we're trying to regulate advanced AI systems. And this is well before we get to AGI or superintelligence. One is we don't know how the systems work. And it's tough to regulate something when you don't know how it works. And the other is we don't know how these systems will interact with human society. And a great example is the video generating large language models that we have now, text to video. We thought a couple of years ago that they were going to be devastating in our electoral processes.
Yeah.
Well, we've just had an election in the UK. As far as I know, video creating LLMs didn't have any impact whatsoever on the UK election. Maybe they will on the US election, maybe not. Now the worry is all about whether Hollywood is going to be turned upside down and all actors are going to be out of a job. It's very hard to forecast the impact that a technology will have on human institutions. So you've got these two large sources of uncertainty in LLMs and other advanced AIs. And so it's really, really hard to regulate it. And we can criticize Microsoft and Meta and the rest as much as we like for not making sure their systems are safe. But I think I'd argue that they can't make them safe because we don't know what they'll do. So the only way to make them safe is to not develop them.
That's a possible conclusion. I'm not willing to jump that far yet. But I think the only way of knowing whether we can make them safe is put the robust investments into seeing if they can be made safe, number one. Number two is what are the dangers that they're posing right now? I don't know about you, but I'm dealing with scams every week. I would like to see an international ban on scamming. Interesting enough, I put this forward one day and 3 days later, I heard the Pope put it forward. But I'm just saying that's an example of something that we actually could regulate, should regulate now, would probably get a worldwide embrace from everybody but the scammers. But in the meantime, Warren Buffett is correct. Scamming is perhaps one of the biggest growth industries in the world, and its impact is unmeasurable. So I think that's a real thing. I think what happened in the UK, you didn't see a lot of deep fake or fake videos because it was pretty clear what was going to happen in the election, and it was a waste of energy. I don't know whether that will be the case in the United States. You can imagine after what has happened in the last week in the United States, and I've basically actually been predicting this for a few years now, that a week before the US election, there's going to be a fake video of Joe Biden falling flat on his face or mumbling incoherently or whatever. So we already have that kind of stuff appearing in the US, and that could make a difference in the US given the tightness of the election, the fact that neither candidate has a majority of people who are overwhelmingly for them, and they all have significant proportions that are overwhelmingly against them. That's a different atmosphere. So I think a deep fake could make a lot of difference here in the United States and in some of the other elections.
So there are some practical measures that people should be getting behind, such as efforts internationally to combat fakes, efforts internationally to combat scams of various sorts. The Control AI group in the UK started campaigning about fake porn, mechanisms used so that normal people could have their faces superimposed onto porn videos. So there are things that can be done, but I want to come back to this general suggestion you raised that we need more robust forms of governance and decision-making. What are you doing to try and bring that about? Where do you see other people working to bring about improved forms of governance and decision-making?
Well, let me talk about old-time things, and then I'll get into what we need that doesn't exist yet. But old-time things, we have exempted the AI oligopoly from being responsible for the downside of the technologies that's deployed. We have exacerbated what has been generally known as the tragedy of the commons when it comes to technology. I don't get it. I don't get how the richest companies in the world get total immunity from any responsibility, any accountability for the downsides of the technologies that are deployed and how they're used. And I think if we just raise that a little bit, we would see significant investments in them in much more robust safety guardrails. That's one example of something that not only could be done, should have been done a long time ago. But we don't do it in the name of the cult of innovation. It'll get in the way of innovation. And of course, China won't do it. So we have the China fear argument. No, there's a right way and a wrong way of doing things. And in the end, if it's truly wrong, those who ignore will also pay prices for that. So I think that's one thing. I think number two, I think we really need to be investing in, and again, the question is, where does the money come from? Well, some of it could come from the AI oligopoly. Why have we created the situation where a good deal of the 1% who own stock in technology companies get wealthy and the rest of the world does not? I'm smart enough to invest in a few stocks, so I'm not going to starve tomorrow. I'm part of the owners of capitalism, but what I have is minuscule compared to what a small percentage of people create. Those small percentage of people have a vested interest. They can speak, they can do some of the work in international tribunals, but no international government should defer to their decision-making processes alone. It's clear what their motives are. Their motives are not necessarily all in society's interest, and they will cut corners that meet their fiduciary responsibilities. So that's the second thing we can do. We can start creating the infrastructure for international governance, but not start with governance yet, but creating robust teams that work together to try to the best of their ability to ferret out the different courses of action, the different scenarios, how those change when a new technology appears, and what they think is the best of those scenarios and what we can do to ameliorate the downsides of those scenarios. And we can see if that can move toward international governance. It's not going to get to international governance short of some tragedy. Hopefully the tragedy is not too great, but the thalidomide scandal at least got us an FDA and got us oversight in both Britain and the US that demanded testing of drugs, some scientific work on drugs before they were released for the public benefit. And I do think that particularly in AI, eventually we will need international governance. And hopefully we can build it from the bottom up so it's not just some superimposition by those who are the most fearful or those who know they can position themselves for power in that governance from the get-go, putting that forward. And hopefully it's international governance with teeth. Will that stop everything? No, it won't stop everything, but boy, it'll sure slow certain things down.
When you say build it from the bottom up, what exactly do you have in mind as that bottom?
Well, the top down would be the UN puts in place a body that has enforcement authority. So there's an imposition from the get-go. The bottom up is we convene an international body which is respected, does thorough research, and tries to ferret out the best courses for us forward. So that's not a body who can put regulation or laws in place. So it may be able to recommend, at least initially on a state level, what is needed, and perhaps on an international level, what is needed.
I would be interested to know what prospect you think there is of getting a wider range of voices involved in governance of AI and other advancing technologies. It sounds like a really good idea, but given how deadlocked political opinion is and societal opinion is on absolutely everything, what chance is there of getting agreement? Something as evidence-led as the IPCC is completely not accepted by a lot of people.
I'm no more naive about international affairs than are you. What we have is not very healthy. I think it's not easy to know how it will come about. It seems to me it's either going to come about or we're going down the road we're going down right now, which is nobody ultimately regulates anything, and bad actors, or what shall I say, actors who have their own personal motivations can do whatever they do without considering the impact of their actions on others are what's going to prevail. But it seems to me if that's what prevails, then there will be these tragic accidents. Hopefully that activates the world community. But can we promise that will? No. So what I'm calling bottom-up international governance is we at least begin to put the mechanisms in place that do some of the work and work through some of the proposals for how, if we ever got to an international governance body, what that might look like. So that when this kind of tragic scenario arises, or when there is the will to act in a cooperative and collective manner, it's not just reacting to whatever crisis happened yesterday. There are actual models that have been tested, that have been worked through, that have a high degree of stakeholder buy-in, that could at least be proposed at that time. Will they prevail? Who knows? That's got a lot to do with what happens between here and there. Which U.S. government is going to be in place is going to be a significant factor in that. So at the moment, just even dealing with that question is going to influence how we deal with the emerging technologies.
But ideally, there can be agreement between groups of people who are quite ideologically opposed or philosophically opposed on many other aspects. They can both set aside some of their ideologies and say, well, all right, there are some things that we do need to be careful about. And one group will say, yes, we need to be careful about this, but it's probably not going to happen. And another group may say, this absolutely needs as much attention as possible. But they can set aside some of their broader philosophies and find some parts where they can build agreement. And hopefully once these agreements grow, then if things do develop in the way that you've suggested, if there's an equivalent of a thalidomide scare or an AI 9/11, then people will say to this citizens' assembly, international citizens' assembly of people who have been thinking about these things, all right, what's the best models that you've come up with? And hopefully at that stage, there will be something with sufficient content that the political leaders and also the commercial leaders will be able to say, all right, let's take this as our starting point, rather than inventing something on the spur of the moment, which almost certainly won't be fit for purpose.
One thing I've learned from studying emerging technologies over the last 20 years or 25 years now, and I go back to when there was probably 100 of us in the world who even cared about this stuff, and now suddenly you have 10,000 AI ethics experts. It's a different world. But I think one thing I have seen is we do not have the institutions, we do not have the ethics, we do not have the philosophies, we do not have the ethos in place to deal with the complexities of challenges that the combination of climate change and all these different technologies is forcing upon us. And that, in effect, inventing that ethos, recognizing this as a global shift, and not totally relying on the old arguments or the old mechanisms is much our job as inventing new technologies.
And with that thought, I want to thank you very much, Wendell, for taking so much time to talk us through some of these scenarios, the vignettes from the past, but also bearing in mind that the future will not be the same as the past. And we're going to have to bear that in mind as we consider the best action to prevent technology from being a dangerous master.
Thank you. I've really been honored to be with you today.
Thanks for joining us, Wendell.
Thanks.